When systems collapse, they don't warn you, they trap you. The lights don't flicker, they vanish. The water doesn't slow, it disappears. Phones still glow, but no one is coming. And in that moment, while the world goes quiet, you realize something terrifying. The countdown didn't start today. It started months ago, and most people already lost. Most people believe SHTF is a sudden explosion, but collapse doesn't scream. It's shelves, empty quietly. Repairs never arrive. Promises replace solutions. History and engineering prove one brutal truth. Families don't collapse from panic. They collapse when time runs out. This video exposes the forbidden stockpile. Not tactical, not cinematic, and never advertised. Yet, it is the only system scientifically proven to keep households alive, weeks after society has already stopped functioning. By the time most people understand this, it's already too late. Most people misunderstand the nature of collapse because they imagine it as a single moment instead of a chain reaction governed by math, energy, flow, and human behavior. They picture riots, fire, and visible chaos, when the real danger arrives quietly through absence. Absence of calories, absence of clean water pressure, absence of reliable information, absence of medical resupply. When those absences align, survival becomes a biological countdown. The body does not negotiate with ideology or optimism. It obeys thermodynamics, hydration limits, and micronutrient thresholds. This is where the forbidden stockpile begins to matter, not as an act of fear, but as an engineered buffer against predictable physiological failure. The hidden science most people overlook is that survival is not primarily about defense or mobility, but about maintaining metabolic stability under stress. The human body, under uncertainty and cold, burns calories faster, dehydrates quicker, and loses cognitive clarity long before it collapses physically. Studies from disaster medicine and famine response consistently show that decision-making quality drops sharply after even mild caloric deficits combined with sleep disruption. That means that by day 3 or 4 of improper intake, people are not just weaker. They are measurably less capable of planning, cooperating, or adapting. A stockpile that only focuses on bulk food without addressing nutrient density, preparation, energy, and digestibility under stress is not a survival system. It is dead weight. This is why the most critical stockpile is rarely discussed openly and often misunderstood even within preparedness circles. It is not about hoarding excess, but about selecting resources that preserve human function with minimal external inputs. Calories that require large amounts of water to prepare become liabilities when municipal pressure fails. Foods that spike blood sugar without sustaining energy increase fatigue and irritability, accelerating social breakdown inside households. The forbidden nature of this stockpile comes from how counterintuitive it feels to a culture trained to equate survival with volume rather than efficiency. In collapse conditions, efficiency is everything. Historical evidence supports this in uncomfortable ways. During prolonged blackouts, sieges, and infrastructure failures documented in the Balkans, post-Soviet regions, and even during extended hurricane aftermaths in developed nations. Households that survived longest were not the ones with the most supplies, but the ones whose supplies aligned with physiological realities. They prioritized shelf-stable fats for energy density, simple proteins that required minimal cooking, electrolytes to preserve hydration efficiency, and redundant methods of preparation that did not rely on a single fuel source. These were not wealthy families or extremists, but ordinary people who understood that systems fail unevenly, and recovery is never as fast as promised. The practical implication is unsettling because it forces a reevaluation of what preparedness actually looks like. Most people stock what they like to eat, not what they can survive on under stress. They assume refrigeration will last longer than it does, or that generators can run indefinitely without maintenance, fuel rotation, or part failure. They forget that noise attracts attention, that fuel degrades, And that resupply becomes impossible when everyone else realizes the same truth at the same time. A forbidden stockpile is quiet, low profile, and optimized for resilience, not comfort. As conditions deteriorate, the stakes escalate rapidly. What begins as inconvenience becomes rationing, then bargaining, then risk-taking. At that stage, families without internal stability are forced outward into uncertainty, where every trip carries exposure to injury, conflict, and irreversible mistakes. The difference between staying sheltered and being forced to move is often just a few days of proper planning, done months or years earlier. This is the invisible line most people cross without realizing it exists. And this is only the first layer. Beneath food and water lies a deeper system that determines whether a household can maintain order, warmth, and coherence. When the external world no longer provides it, that system is rarely named, rarely taught, and almost never prioritized. Yet it governs whether every other resource can even be used effectively once the grid goes dark. That deeper system is energy management, not in the abstract sense of electricity alone, but in the fundamental ability to convert stored resources into usable outcomes without waste, exposure, or dependency. When people think about energy in survival contexts, they imagine generators, solar panels, or fuel cans. But those are only surface manifestations of a much broader principle. How much effort, heat, time, and risk it takes to turn stored supplies into life-sustaining function. This is where most well-intentioned preparations quietly fail. They accumulate resources that look sufficient on paper, but collapse under the friction of real-world constraints. Consider cooking as an example, because it reveals the hidden physics at play. Many emergency foods require prolonged boiling or high sustained heat, which assumes abundant water, fuel, and safe ventilation. In a grid-down environment, each of those assumptions becomes fragile. Fuel is finite and heavy. Open flames increase fire risk and visibility. Water used for cooking cannot be reused for drinking. Over days, these inefficiencies compound until a household is forced to choose between warmth, hydration, or calories. The forbidden stockpile accounts for this by prioritizing foods and systems that minimize conversion loss, preserving energy at every step from storage to consumption. This principle extends beyond food into thermal regulation, one of the most underestimated killers in collapse scenarios. Humans survive within a narrow temperature band, and maintaining that band consumes enormous amounts of energy when infrastructure fails. In cold environments, people burn calories simply to stay warm, accelerating food depletion. In hot environments, dehydration and electrolyte loss increase exponentially. History shows that exposure kills more reliably than violence, especially among populations that underestimate it. A stockpile that does not include insulation strategies, passive heat retention, and low-energy cooling methods is incomplete, regardless of how much food it contains. Why is this knowledge overlooked? Because modern life has insulated people from the true cost of energy. Flip a switch, and heat appears. Turn a knob, and clean water flows. These conveniences obscure the reality that every comfort is the result of massive, coordinated energy expenditure. When that coordination breaks, individuals are forced to pay those costs themselves, often without realizing how quickly the bill comes due. The forbidden stockpile is, at its core, a collection of tools, materials, and consumables that reduce personal energy expenditure when external systems disappear. Scientific studies on disaster resilience consistently show that households with lower energy dependency recover faster and experience less internal conflict. Stress hormones decrease when basic needs are met reliably, even at reduced levels. Sleep quality improves when thermal comfort is maintained. Decision-making stabilizes when meals are predictable and hydration is sufficient. These are not luxuries. They are control variables in human performance under stress. Ignoring them does not make one tough, it makes one vulnerable. The escalation here is subtle but relentless. As days turn into weeks, Systems that were assumed temporary begin to feel permanent. Repair crews do not arrive. Shelves remain empty. Information becomes fragmented and unreliable at this stage. Families without efficient internal systems are forced into reactive behavior, trading, scavenging, or relocating under pressure. Each action increases exposure to risk, injury, and irreversible loss. Meanwhile, households that invested in efficiency rather than excess quietly reduce their footprint, conserve resources, and wait. This is where the conversation shifts from survival to endurance. Short-term emergency thinking fails beyond the first week because it does not account for fatigue, boredom, illness, and psychological strain. The forbidden stockpile addresses these factors indirectly by preserving routine, predictability, and a sense of control. A warm meal prepared with minimal effort, clean water that does not require constant purification, a sleeping environment that allows rest without vigilance. These are force multipliers that compound over time. But even this is not the full picture. Beneath energy management lies an even more uncomfortable reality about social dynamics, visibility, and the silent mathematics of scarcity. As resources tighten, human behavior changes in predictable patterns, and the way a household stores, uses, and reveals its stockpile can determine whether it remains insulated from that change or becomes a target within it. Scarcity does not announce itself with alarms or official declarations. It reveals itself through behavior. Voices get louder in public spaces. Small arguments escalate, and people begin to watch each other's hands more closely than their faces. This shift is not moral failure. It is biology responding to perceived threat. As resources contract, humans revert to pattern recognition and risk assessment, scanning for advantage or vulnerability. In this environment, the most dangerous thing a household can do is advertise stability, while others are destabilizing. This is why the forbidden stockpile is designed not only around what you have, but around what others can see you using. Visibility becomes a form of currency during prolonged disruption. The sound of a generator, the smell of cooked food, the regular disposal of waste, or even consistent lighting at night can signal surplus to those who are quietly running out. Historical accounts from sieges, extended blackouts, and post-disaster urban zones consistently show that conflict rarely begins with organized violence. It begins with observation, followed by probing, then escalation. A household that unintentionally broadcasts abundance invites attention long before desperation turns overt. The overlooked principle here is that security is not solely about physical defense, but about demand management. If no one believes you have what they need, they are less likely to test you. This is why the most resilient stockpiles emphasize low signal consumption, foods that produce minimal odor, systems that operate silently, lighting that is contained and shielded, waste that is neutralized rather than exposed. These choices are not about paranoia. They are about reducing informational leakage in a stressed environment, where information itself becomes a survival asset. Scientific research into human behavior during resource shortages supports this pattern. Studies from disaster sociology show that theft and confrontation spike not simply where resources are scarce, but where inequality of access is visible. People are less likely to challenge an unknown and more likely to confront a perceived imbalance they can observe. In practical terms, this means that a household quietly consuming modest, consistent rations is statistically safer than one alternating between visible abundance and sudden austerity. Consistency reduces curiosity, and curiosity is often the precursor to conflict. The forbidden stockpile also accounts for degradation over time, something most preparedness plans ignore. Packaging fails, containers crack, pests find entry points, vitamins oxidize, fuel loses volatility, water grows biologically active. None of these failures are dramatic, but they are cumulative. A system that looks sufficient on day 1 may be compromised by day 30, if it lacks redundancy and inspection intervals. This is why serious preparedness emphasizes rotation, modular storage, and layered backups rather than a single, centralized cache. Failure is assumed, planned for, and absorbed rather than resisted. As weeks pass, the psychological landscape shifts further. People begin to anchor their decisions to rumors, partial information, and visible cues rather than verified data. Stress narrows perception. Risk tolerance increases, not because people become braver, but because the alternative feels worse. This is the stage where many families make irreversible choices, leaving shelter, trading critical supplies, or trusting unknown actors out of necessity. These decisions are rarely framed as mistakes. At the time, they feel logical under pressure. The forbidden stockpile is designed to delay this moment, extending the window in which rational, low-risk choices remain possible. Yet even a perfectly managed household does not exist in isolation. External systems, even degraded ones, continue to exert influence. Weather shifts. Secondary crises emerge. Health issues that were manageable under normal conditions become life-threatening without support. At this level, survival is no longer just about holding on, but about navigating a moving landscape of risk with limited inputs. The difference between stability and collapse narrows to a margin measured in preparation depth, not bravery. And there is still one more layer, often ignored because it forces an uncomfortable reevaluation of modern dependence. Beyond food, energy, and discretion lies the question of medical resilience, a domain where mistakes compound faster and forgiveness is rare. Medical resilience is where unprepared systems fail silently and irreversibly. In stable societies, illness and injury are inconveniences mitigated by infrastructure, supply chains, and trained professionals. In collapse conditions, those buffers vanish, and the human body reverts to a far harsher accounting. Infections that would normally be trivial become life-threatening. Minor wounds turn septic. Chronic conditions escalate without maintenance. Medications. The forbidden stockpile recognizes that survival is not only about staying fed and hidden, but about preserving biological function when help is no longer on the way. The critical misunderstanding here is the belief that medical preparedness is synonymous with trauma kits or dramatic interventions. While bleeding control and emergency response matter, the majority of medical failures and prolonged disruption come from mundane causes. Dehydration, leading to kidney stress. Electrolyte imbalance, triggering cardiac irregularities. Untreated infections progressing beyond the point of containment. And nutritional deficiencies, weakening immune response. These are slow killers, invisible at first, but relentless. A household that ignores them may appear stable for weeks, before collapsing abruptly. Scientific data from disaster zones and prolonged care disruptions consistently show that preventive care outperforms reactive treatment. Clean water prevents more illness than antibiotics. Proper nutrition supports immune response better than emergency drugs. Wound hygiene and early intervention reduce mortality far more effectively than last-minute improvisation. The forbidden stockpile integrates this reality by emphasizing supplies that maintain baseline health rather than heroic measures. Antiseptics, barrier protection, hydration support, basic diagnostic tools, and redundancy in essential medications quietly save more lives than any advanced device. There is also the issue of knowledge decay. Medical equipment without training becomes useless or dangerous. Instructions forgotten under stress lead to errors. This is why resilience includes not just supplies, but familiarity, routine, and simplification. Systems that require minimal interpretation are more reliable when cognitive load is high. Historical accounts from prolonged crises show that households with simple, well-practiced medical routines fare better than those relying on complex interventions they rarely use. Complexity is a liability when sleep is fragmented and anxiety is constant. As time extends, the stakes escalate again. Injuries accumulate through fatigue and minor accidents. Immune systems weaken under stress. Dental issues, often overlooked, become sources of severe infection and pain. Mental health deteriorates, affecting judgment and cohesion. These are not separate problems. They interact, amplifying each other. Pain reduces sleep. Poor sleep degrades immunity. Infection increases caloric demand. Increased demand accelerates resource depletion. The forbidden stockpile is designed to interrupt these feedback loops early, preserving stability before degradation cascades. This layer of preparedness is often avoided because it forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths about dependency and fragility. Modern life has outsourced resilience to institutions, and when those institutions falter, the gap is stark. Medical resilience does not mean replacing professionals. It means buying time, preventing deterioration, and avoiding decisions that cannot be undone. Time in collapse scenarios is the most valuable currency, and medical failures spend it faster than almost anything else. As the external environment continues to shift, another pressure emerges that cannot be stockpiled directly: information integrity. Knowing when to stay, when to adapt, and when to move depends on the quality of signals received. In disrupted systems, information becomes distorted, delayed, or weaponized by circumstance. The ability to filter, verify, and act on limited data becomes a survival skill in itself. Information integrity becomes the final hinge on which long-term survival turns, because every decision made under uncertainty compounds forward. In functioning societies, information is ambient and abundant, often taken for granted. Weather alerts arrive automatically. Medical advice is a search away. Supply availability is visible in real time. When systems degrade, information fragments into rumor, outdated signals, and partial truths. Acting on bad information can be more dangerous than acting on none at all. Yet waiting too long can be just as fatal. The forbidden stockpile does not solve this problem directly, but it buys the one resource that makes good decisions possible: time. Time allows patterns to emerge. It allows false alarms to dissipate and real threats to clarify. Households forced into early movement or risky exchanges because they lack internal stability are making decisions at the worst possible moment, when noise is highest and signal is lowest. Historical analysis of evacuations and displacement consistently shows that early, unnecessary movement carries higher mortality than delayed informed action. People leave safe shelter for perceived safety elsewhere, only to encounter exposure, exhaustion, and conflict. En route, the forbidden stockpile delays desperation, and in doing so, preserves decision quality. The science behind this is rooted in cognitive load theory. Under stress, the brain prioritizes immediate threats and discounts long-term consequences. Hunger, dehydration, pain, and sleep deprivation narrow perception and increase susceptibility to persuasive but inaccurate information. This is why misinformation spreads fastest during crises. Not because people become foolish, but because their biological safeguards are overwhelmed. A household that maintains caloric stability, hydration, warmth, and routine retains a measurable cognitive advantage. They are better able to cross-check claims, observe trends, and resist impulsive action. There is also the matter of communication asymmetry. As infrastructure degrades, different areas recover at different rates. One neighborhood may regain partial power, while another remains dark. One region may receive aid, while another is bypassed. Information from outside sources may be delayed or irrelevant to local conditions. The forbidden stockpile reduces reliance on external updates by making immediate survival less contingent on real-time guidance. This independence reduces the pressure to act prematurely on incomplete data. Over time, large-scale patterns become visible to those who can afford to watch and wait. Supply restoration timelines reveal whether systems are stabilizing or unraveling. Human traffic patterns, indicate whether displacement is accelerating or slowing. Environmental cues, such as waste accumulation, water quality changes, and noise levels, offer more reliable information than official statements. In many cases, this observational intelligence is only available to those not consumed by daily survival tasks. Again, efficiency creates awareness. As the situation matures, the concept of after begins to lose meaning. Collapse is not a single valley followed by recovery, but a series of plateaus and drops. Systems return partially, then fail again. Aid arrives, then stops. Prices fluctuate wildly. In this environment, the forbidden stockpile transitions from emergency buffer to long-term stabilizer. It supports a household through uncertainty, without locking it into false expectations of rapid normalization. This leads to the final, often unspoken truth about preparedness. It is not about surviving the worst day, but about surviving the longest period of ambiguity. Most people can endure short-term hardship. Far fewer can endure prolonged uncertainty without making catastrophic decisions. The forbidden stockpile exists to stretch that endurance, to keep options open when others are forced to choose between bad and worse. At scale, this pattern repeats across regions and generations. Those who understand systems, who prepare quietly and efficiently, tend to endure transitions with less loss. Those who rely on reassurance, visibility, or last-minute action are repeatedly surprised by how quickly margins disappear. This is not a moral judgment. It is an observation supported by history, engineering, and biology. And this brings us to the uncomfortable conclusion that preparedness is not about fear of collapse, but acceptance of fragility. Modern life is optimized, not resilient. When optimization fails, resilience determines outcomes. The forbidden stockpile is simply a physical manifestation of that understanding. A recognition that stability is something you build quietly long before you are forced to test it. When viewed from a distance, this pattern reveals something deeper than individual preparedness. It exposes a structural mismatch between how modern systems are designed and how humans actually survive disruption. Optimization rewards speed, efficiency, and minimal redundancy, because under normal conditions, redundancy looks like waste. Resilience, by contrast, depends on slack, buffers, and excess capacity, all of which appear irrational until the moment they are needed. The forbidden stockpile sits at the intersection of these two philosophies, quietly rejecting optimization in favor of survivability. This is why preparedness advice that focuses on extreme scenarios often misses the point. The most dangerous failures are not dramatic, but systemic. A trucking delay becomes a food shortage. A power outage becomes a water crisis. A staffing shortfall becomes a medical emergency. Each step is logical in isolation, yet devastating in sequence. Families caught inside these cascades often insist that no single failure should have been fatal, and they are correct. What kills is the alignment of multiple small failures without buffers between them. The forbidden stockpile exists to insert friction into that cascade, slowing it, absorbing it, and preventing it from reaching critical thresholds. Engineering disciplines refer to this as fault tolerance. Systems designed with fault tolerance assume components will fail and are structured so that those failures do not propagate uncontrollably. In contrast, brittle systems work perfectly until they do not, and then they collapse abruptly. Modern households are often brittle by default, dependent on uninterrupted flows of energy, food, medicine, and information. Prepared households deliberately introduce fault tolerance at the domestic level, creating micro-resilience within macro-instability. This approach also reframes the psychology of survival. People who prepare for specific disasters often fixate on scenarios they can imagine, while ignoring those they cannot. Earthquakes, storms, and blackouts are easier to conceptualize than slow institutional decay or rolling infrastructure failure. The forbidden stockpile is scenario agnostic. It does not care why systems fail only that they eventually do, by focusing on universal human requirements rather than specific threats. It remains relevant across a wide range of conditions. Over time, this mindset alters behavior even before any crisis occurs. Households become more aware of consumption patterns, waste, and dependency. They learn which comforts are essential and which are optional. They test assumptions about convenience and discover where single points of failure hide. This awareness itself becomes a form of preparedness, reducing shock when disruption arrives. People are less likely to panic when reality diverges from expectation if they have already questioned those expectations. As instability persists, the social environment continues to evolve. Informal networks form, barter emerges, trust becomes localized and conditional. Those with nothing are forced into visibility, while those with quiet sufficiency remain opaque. This dynamic is not about selfishness. It is about survival geometry. Resources that are shared too early or too widely may disappear before recovery becomes possible. The forbidden stockpile does not encourage isolation, but it allows generosity to be deliberate rather than coerced, timed rather than reactive. This is where ethical considerations quietly enter the picture. Preparedness is often framed as individualism, but in practice, it reduces strain on shared systems and emergency responders. Families that can care for themselves longer free up resources for those who cannot. This secondary effect is rarely discussed, yet it is one of the strongest arguments for widespread resilience. A society with distributed buffers fails more slowly and recovers more unevenly, but with fewer irreversible losses. Still, even the best preparation does not guarantee comfort or safety. It guarantees only options. It preserves the ability to choose rather than react, to wait rather than flee, to think rather than panic. In collapse dynamics, those distinctions define survival. The forbidden stockpile is not a promise of security, but a hedge against inevitability, acknowledging that systems will falter and that human lives operate on timelines that do not pause for logistics. As the noise of the outside world grows louder and the signals more distorted, those with internal stability experience a different reality. Days regain structure. Decisions slow down. The urgency that drives others into dangerous action becomes background pressure rather than a command. This is the quiet advantage that rarely makes headlines or dramatic retellings, because it looks like nothing happening at all. And it is precisely in that nothing, that waiting without desperation, that the true value of the forbidden stockpile reveals itself, setting the stage for the final warning that most people only understand when it is already too late. The final warning is not about a single event or a specific timeline, but about a mindset that modern life quietly encourages and collapse brutally punishes. It is the belief that systems will always fail loudly enough to give warning, that authorities will always know more than individuals, and that adaptation can always happen after disruption begins. History, science, and engineering all point to the opposite conclusion. Systems often fail silently at first. Information lags reality, and adaptation becomes exponentially harder once margins are gone. The forbidden stockpile exists to counter this belief, not with fear, but with preparation rooted in realism. When margins disappear, choices compress. Options that once seemed flexible become binary. Stay or move, share or defend, risk or retreat. These choices are rarely clean or moral in the abstract. They are shaped by biology, exhaustion, and uncertainty. People who enter this phase without buffers are not making poor decisions. They are making the only decisions left to them. This is the tragedy of unpreparedness. It is not ignorance, but misplaced trust in continuity. The forbidden stockpile is a quiet acknowledgement that continuity is conditional. There is a philosophical weight to this that goes beyond supplies and logistics. Preparedness is an act of responsibility across time. It recognizes that future versions of ourselves will inherit the consequences of present assumptions. In stable periods, this responsibility feels abstract. In unstable periods, it becomes immediate and unforgiving. Those who prepared did not predict collapse. They simply refused to assume permanence. That distinction matters. Large-scale disruptions throughout history share a common feature. They expose the gap between expectation and reality. People expect help to arrive sooner, systems to recover faster, and normalcy to reassert itself with minimal loss. When those expectations fail, psychological shock compounds material scarcity. The forbidden stockpile narrows that gap, aligning expectation with possibility. It does not eliminate suffering, but it prevents surprise from becoming panic. This is why such preparation is often discouraged culturally, not through conspiracy, but through discomfort. It forces acknowledgement of fragility, interdependence, and limits. It challenges the narrative that progress is linear and permanent. Yet the science of resilience makes one thing clear. Acknowledging limits is not pessimism, it is competence. Engineers design for failure. Ecologists study collapse and renewal. Emergency planners assume worst cases not because they expect them, but because consequences demand it. As systems continue to strain under complexity, scale, and optimization pressure, periods of instability become more likely, not less. This does not mean catastrophe is inevitable, but it does mean that relying on uninterrupted service is increasingly risky. The forbidden stockpile is not a rejection of society, but a supplement to it, a personal reserve of stability that reduces dependence at critical moments. The uncomfortable truth is that by the time most people recognize the need for such preparation, the opportunity to build it has already passed. Shelves are empty. Supply lines are frozen. Information is unreliable. The window for quiet, rational action closes quickly. Once fear enters the equation, this is why preparation is always framed as too early, until it is suddenly too late. In the end, survival is not about outlasting others, but about outlasting uncertainty. Those who can do that do not look heroic or dramatic. They look ordinary, calm, and unremarkable. And that is the point. The forbidden stockpile is invisible, not because it is secret, but because true resilience rarely announces itself. It simply waits, absorbing shock, until the world remembers how fragile it always was. And even after all of this is understood, there remains a final layer that most people resist confronting, because it challenges identity rather than logistics. Preparedness changes how you see normal life. Once you understand how thin the margin is, convenience stops feeling permanent and starts feeling conditional. Supermarkets no longer look like abundance, but like synchronized timing. Power grids look less like guarantees and more like negotiations between load and capacity. This awareness is not anxiety, it is calibration. It aligns perception with reality, which is something collapse forces brutally and without consent. The forbidden stockpile, then, is not just a collection of items, but a refusal to outsource all responsibility for survival to systems optimized for profit, speed, and appearance, rather than durability. It is a recognition that resilience must exist at multiple scales simultaneously: individual, household, community, and infrastructure. When one scale fails, the others must absorb the shock. If none are prepared, failure accelerates. This is why collapse often feels sudden, even when it has been developing for years. Buffers were never there. There is also a generational aspect, rarely discussed. Knowledge of preservation, rationing, repair, and self-sufficiency was once common, passed down through necessity. As systems improved, that knowledge atrophied, replaced by trust in services and specialization. The forbidden stockpile quietly reintroduces fragments of that older understanding, not as nostalgia, but as functional redundancy. It reconnects modern households with basic principles of storage, maintenance, and conservation that remain valid regardless of technology level. This does not mean withdrawing from society or expecting the worst at all times. It means accepting that risk is unevenly distributed and that preparedness shifts that distribution. Those who prepare are not immune to hardship, but they experience it differently. Stress arrives slower. Decisions have more room. Mistakes are survivable rather than terminal. In complex systems, this margin often determines outcomes more than intelligence, strength, or luck. As instability continues to test modern assumptions, one pattern remains consistent. People regret not preparing far more often than they regret preparing too much. Excess food can be rotated. Extra water can be used. Redundant tools can sit quietly for years. But missing buffers cannot be improvised once systems are stressed. At that point, improvisation becomes gambling, and the odds are rarely favorable. The forbidden stockpile is not forbidden by law or authority. It is forbidden by psychology. It requires acting before emotion provides permission, investing in outcomes you hope never arrive, and accepting that responsibility cannot be deferred indefinitely. These are uncomfortable truths in a culture built on immediacy and reassurance. Yet discomfort is a small price compared to the cost of learning these lessons under pressure. What ultimately separates those who endure from those who are overwhelmed is not foresight in predicting events, but humility in accepting uncertainty. Prepared households do not claim to know what will happen next. They simply acknowledge that something will, and that being unready is a choice with consequences. The forbidden stockpile is the physical expression of choosing otherwise. And if there is a single idea worth carrying forward, it is this: collapse does not begin when systems fail, but when people lose the ability to wait calmly for clarity. Anything that preserves that ability preserves life itself. That is the quiet purpose behind every stored calorie, every sealed container, every redundant system. Not fear, not hoarding. Time is the one resource no institution can distribute equally once disruption begins. It cannot be printed, shipped, or restored after it is spent. Every hour of stability a household preserves reduces exposure to error, violence, illness, and irreversible choice. This is why the forbidden stockpile is fundamentally about temporal leverage. It stretches the present, so the future has room to arrive in a recognizable form. Without it, people are dragged forward by events they no longer control, reacting instead of deciding. There is a moment in every prolonged disruption when people realize the language has changed. Officials stop giving timelines and start giving conditions. Promises turn into assessments. Words like soon and temporary quietly disappear. This is the inflection point where expectation collapses faster than infrastructure. Those who prepare recognize this shift immediately, not because they are cynical, but because they understand how recovery actually works. Systems are rebuilt by priority, not fairness, and households without buffers fall to the bottom of that list by default. The forbidden stockpile does not make a family invisible to hardship, but it changes their position relative to it. Instead of being swept along by every fluctuation, they experience disruption as a series of manageable adjustments. They can pause, observe, and choose. They can wait out misinformation, avoid unnecessary exposure, and conserve strength, while others burn through it. This differential compounds over time, quietly widening the gap between endurance and exhaustion. There is no dramatic payoff to this approach. No applause. No visible victory. The reward is simply continuity, the ability to maintain identity, values, and coherence, while the external environment becomes unstable. Families that endure do not tell heroic stories. They tell mundane ones about meals eaten, routines kept, arguments avoided, and nights slept safely indoors. These stories rarely circulate, yet they represent the majority of successful outcomes in every documented collapse. In the end, preparedness is not about stockpiles, scenarios, or fear. It is about refusing to confuse convenience with permanence. It is about understanding that modern systems work brilliantly, till they don't tend that when they falter. Responsibility contracts inward with alarming speed. The forbidden stockpile is a quiet, rational response to that reality, built not on panic, but on respect for how fragile order actually is. What happens next will always be uncertain. But uncertainty does not have to mean helplessness. Those who prepare are not predicting disaster. They are preparing for ambiguity. They are choosing to meet the unknown with margin instead of hope alone. And when the lights flicker, the water pressure drops, and the world hesitates just long enough to reveal its seams. That margin becomes the difference between being carried by events and standing still long enough to decide what comes next.